to once again begin our Lenten journey. He has once again allowed us to see another great Lent. For today, we begin the Lenten Triodium. Today and the next 2 Sundays are the preparatory Sundays that lead us to the beginning of the Great Fast. The fast is called great because it indeed is a great endeavor. And the Church understands that before we can begin such an important task, we have to be prepared. And so the Church gives us these 3 preparatory Sundays and important lessons before we begin our journey. Today's Gospel reading is the first lesson of humility. We heard how our Lord taught by a parable about the Publican and the Pharisee. And two of them came to the temple to pray. The Pharisee was, in the eyes of men, a very just man. We hear how he himself reminded God. Could you imagine the audacity? But he reminded God of all the things he has done. How he fasts twice a week, gives tithe of all that he has. He's not a fornicator. He keeps the commandments. And the publican, the tax collector, who committed many sins and led a life of treachery, also stood in the temple and prayed. But his only prayer was, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The contrast is striking. Here the Pharisee led a righteous life, but by his prayers, we question what was the center of his life, because he was full of pride. He was caught up in himself. He was satisfied with all the accomplishments in his life. What he basically did by having such deep-rooted pride is that he replaced the center of his life. The center of his life was no longer God, but himself. That's what pride does. Pride, St. Macarius of Optima says, is the root of all of our problems, all of our misfortunes, all of our sorrows. Because pride separates us from God. Pride is the root of all sin. And we know what sin has done to this world. And we experience ourselves what sin does to us. And so pride, being the root of all this, of course separates us and establishes a new center. For the Pharisee, God was not the purpose of his life. The purpose was changed. God was no longer the center of his activity, but it was the sense of accomplishment. Look at what I have done. Pride also rears its head in very sneaky ways. Pride, when it takes hold of a person, expresses itself in different manners. We know pride causes people to be easily insulted. It's hard for a prideful person to forgive. A prideful person holds on to resentments, sometimes for years and years. A prideful person wants his or her opinion heard and followed. A prideful person wants his or her will established. A prideful person seeks many times to fulfill all his or her own physical desires and pleasures. Again, we could put a whole list of activities and behaviors that ultimately reflect one thing, that the person is the center of his or her life and not God. The publican, the tax collector, lived exactly that lifestyle. He lived a life of pleasure. He lived a life of seeking wealth. He imposed his will. Tax collectors were ruthless people. He asserted his will, lied and cheated, was far from anything righteous. But his prayer was heard, and God said he walked away justified because he realized his sin. Because he realized that he placed himself as the center of his life and not God, and he wanted to change. And when a person opens up his heart to change, God comes in and takes abode and helps that person. The publican no longer wanted to be the center of his life. He wanted God to be the center of his life. And God came and forgave him and justified him and took up abode in his heart. And so, brothers and sisters, the lesson that we have to learn today is the glory of humility. That's not an oxymoron. Because glory here is understood not in the human sense of the word glory, prideful, established, but rather glory as in holiness and righteousness and purity. Humility brings us that glory. St. Macarius of Optima also says that humility helps us to serve as a weapon against all kinds of sin. If a person is humble, he is strengthened to overcome sin. The very end of today's gospel reading, it says, a prideful person will be humbled, or he who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That exaltation is the glory of our human nature as it was originally intended to be. God created us to commune with him. He created us to be in his presence. He created us as the image and as his image and likeness. And sin, pride, took that away from us. Took away from us communion with God. Distorted that image and likeness. We no longer could reflect God's light, God's righteousness. But with our Lord coming into this world, he reestablishes the exaltation of the human person, the human nature. He reestablishes the sanctity of our souls. He reestablishes the image and likeness by which we were created, so that we can commune with God as he originally intended. And so when we live a humble life, when we humble ourselves, we establish God as the center, and that is our exaltation. That is our glory. Because that's what we were created to do. But when we exalt ourselves, we reject humility. We reject God as the center of our life. Just as Adam and Eve rejected God's commandment not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And by doing so, they establish themselves as their own gods. So when we humble ourselves, we place God as the center of our life. When we humble ourselves, we begin the journey of striving to live according to God's commandments so that we may live as He intended us to live, with Him as the center of our life, and by striving to always be in communion with Him. And yes, it's not easy. We live in a fallen world. Just go in the car and even on your drive home from church, imagine all of the temptations that we have to encounter. And that's just on Sunday. We go back to work, and again, we get into the rut. We have our own difficulties, our own temptations. And in addition to that, we have our own shortcomings in how we deal with life. And it's not easy. But with God, all things are possible. God showed the depth of His compassion by forgiving today's publican. He shows the depth of His compassion every time we run to Him in prayer, every time we come to confession, every time we fall down on our knees asking for His mercy. He shows the depth of His compassion to restore us, to refresh us, to renew us. And so, brothers and sisters, let us begin this Lenten journey and prepare for it by learning today's lesson of humility. We all strive to overcome sin in its various forms. The first and most important weapon we have at our disposal is humility. Let us humble ourselves. Humble ourselves by coming to confession regularly and frequently. Humble ourselves by praying every day, morning and night, as the fathers taught us to pray in the prayer books. Let us humble ourselves by following God's commandments, by seeking His will in everything that we do. Let us humble ourselves by having Christ as the center of all of our activity. Let us humble ourselves by being patient and forgiving with others, letting go of resentments. Let us humble ourselves by being respectful of others and not quick to be insulted. Let us humble ourselves so that we can be exalted for Christ's sake and for our salvation. And if we take upon ourselves the robe of humility, we will be better clothed to take on this journey of Great Lent. Because by itself, the fast has for us many trials and difficulties that lie ahead. But if we're humble, we will be open to God's grace to help us in the struggle. So let us, brothers and sisters, humble ourselves so that we can be exalted.